Ladies and gentlemen, even if you believe that Mr. Valliere's Mercedes was there at the time of the shooting, the government presented zero evidence to convince you beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Valliere was there. And even if you believe that Mr. Valliere was there at the time of the shooting, they presented zero evidence to convince you beyond reasonable doubt that he was the shooter. Before I get into the details of my argument, I first want to thank each and every one of you for your diligent service, for giving up your time, your families, your work, for being here and listening to the evidence attentively and conscientiously. There are certain fundamentals of law that the judge explained to you when we first began the trial that I just want to take a brief moment to remind you. She mentioned the presumption of innocence, that Mr. Valliere is presumed under the law to be innocent of all the charges until if and when only you, the jury, decide otherwise. And what does that mean? That means that as he's sitting here in this courtroom at this very moment, the law presumes him to be innocent. She also mentioned your function as the jurors. And remember what that function is when you go off to that room and deliberate. To have listened attentively to the evidence, to assess the credibility of the witnesses and the evidence that was presented before you by the government, to weigh the evidence, whether it's important or insignificant, or if you choose to reject that evidence that the government presented to you. And as I told you in my opening, somebody died here. Javon Brown was shot and he was killed. That's undisputed. But remember the oath that you all took as jurors, to decide this case only on the evidence presented, without bias, without sympathy, without emotion, without prejudice, and only on the evidence and on the facts as you, the jury, find them. And the judge also explained to you when we first began, and I'm sure she'll give you a more detailed instruction when we finish the arguments, about reasonable doubt and about the government's burden in this case. That the entirety of the burden is on the government. It's their duty and their job to convince you beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Valliere committed this crime. Now, obviously, with regard to the evidence that you heard, we have over, I think, 120 exhibits and, 15 plus witnesses. And some of what you heard is not disputed. There is evidence in this case that's not in dispute. And what is that? Well, obviously, Mr. Brown was shot. No one disputes that. Well, what is disputed is who shot him. And I would submit to you that Mr. Valliere did not shoot him, that he was not the shooter. What else is undisputed? Well, Mr. Valliere's cell phone was located at Metro PCS. That's not disputed. That was never challenged. I'd suggest it's insignificant in the overall spectrum of the case. The text messages that were introduced from that cell phone are meaningless. They give you absolutely no direction as to whether or not Mr. Valliere pulled that trigger. They don't even tell you, that cell phone and those text messages don't even tell you if Mr. Valliere was even there at the time of the shooting. What else is undisputed? The blood evidence, the DNA evidence, the gunshot residue evidence. We heard from 4, 5 forensic scientists that explained to you the scientific principles, that explained to you how the evidence was extracted from the scene, how the evidence was preserved, how it was tested with all the sophisticated software and machinery and scientific methods. You heard from these well-educated and very experienced professionals about how they analyzed the scientific evidence, and none of that was disputed. So as I mentioned, even if you believe that Mr. Valliere was at Coggeshall Street in the area of Belleville and Coggeshall, the government has not proven to you that he pulled that trigger, that he had that gun. And it's their own evidence that gives you that reasonable doubt. It's their own evidence that convinces you that he wasn't the shooter. See, what they've done here, what the government has done in this case, they've built a house of cards, okay? Or if you ever played Jenga, and you stack up the blocks like a tower, and then you pull out a piece from the bottom, and you put it on the top. And you keep doing that. And eventually, you see the tower wavering. And the more pieces you pull out from that bottom tower, the more cards you pull out from that house of cards, eventually it's going to shatter and fall. That's exactly what happened in this case. They came to you and presented you with a theory. They presented you with a case and told you a number of different things. They promised you certain evidence, and they failed to follow through with that evidence because their house of cards collapsed. Like in their opening statement, when they told you, we got the black sweatshirt, we got the hat, we went to his house and we found it, and we're going to show you that evidence. We're going to show you the black sweatshirt those witnesses saw that day. We're going to show you the red hat the witnesses saw that day. You know, by the time you heard from those scientists, that sweatshirt, if Mr. Valliere was wearing that sweatshirt, if he was wearing that hat, if he was the shooter, their own science, their own case just proved to you that he's not the shooter. You have no DNA, you have no blood, and you have no gunshot residue. Their own case just proved their case wrong. Their own case just gave you reasonable doubt. You can't have it both ways. The government can't have it both ways when it comes to their evidence. They can't get up here and tell you one thing. They can't present witnesses and give you one theory and tell you this is how it is, and then give you other witnesses and tell you, oh, it's no big deal. No big deal, the sweatshirt didn't have any blood on it. No big deal, the sweatshirt didn't have any gunshot residue on it. No big deal, the sneakers didn't have any blood on it. Yeah, it's a big deal. It's a very big deal. It's reasonable doubt. They have zero motive in this case, zero connection between Mr. Valliere and Mr. Brown. So what do? They start grasping for straws. And they parade up Detective Michaela Saunders, who tells you what? Oh, Oh, we found money in Mr. Brown's pockets. Oh, we found money in the cash register. Okay? There's absolutely no evidence of a robbery in this case. Why did they tell you that? It means nothing, absolutely nothing in this case. Zero evidence from witnesses or otherwise to suggest that whoever went in that Metro P6 at that time was there to rob Mr. Brown. Nothing was taken. Nothing. And she even told you on cross-examination, yeah, the registers were untouched. They were not disheveled. They were not damaged. Nothing was taken. The house of cards collapsing right before their very eyes. Smoke screen for you because their case has nothing, because they have no motive. They have no explanation as to what happened that day. The most important part of the police investigation in this case, you know what that was. It was the eyewitnesses. It was the people who were there. It was the people who saw any little thing. That was the most important part of this case. Not the Mercedes, not the donut, not the sweatshirt, not the surveillance cameras. It's the eyewitnesses, ladies and gentlemen. They're the only people that were there that could have told you what happened that day. And they couldn't do that. Why? Because either they didn't remember, or they got their stories mixed up, or their memory was contaminated. Well, how was it contaminated? You heard from a lot of police officers about how chaotic the scene was. You heard from a lot of witnesses about how chaotic the scene was. Police did a great job when they responded to the scene in tending to Mr. Brown, in securing the evidence, cordoning off the scene, not letting it get contaminated, extracting and locating whatever evidence there was. Beautiful job. But they messed up. And they messed up because they didn't immediately secure the most important piece of evidence in this case, and that was the witnesses. The witnesses, they let them be gathered right across the crime scene tape. They were talking amongst themselves. And the witnesses told you that. The witnesses told you that. And the police told you that. You think these people in exhibit number 20 are just standing there doing nothing? You heard evidence that they're talking. What are they talking about? What weather it was? They're talking about what they saw before the police spoke to them, before the police were able to secure their statements. All the witnesses were spoken to or interviewed in the days following the incident, not that day. It's natural. It's common sense. Draw from your common experiences. You're driving down the highway. You see an accident or you see something happen in your life. You share that with somebody. It's natural for that to happen. But it's the police's responsibility to not let that happen, to prevent that contamination of evidence from the most important part of this case, to prevent the spoliation of that person's memory and perception of what they saw or didn't see. And we saw that firsthand. Do you remember Edward Reeves, the older man with the glasses, who told you, I don't need glasses when I'm driving, but you all saw him testify. Could he see 2 feet in front of him? You're able to evaluate his demeanor on your own. his ability to recollect the events from that day and relate them to you as accurately as possible. He couldn't even remember his own son's age. And he comes in here and tells you, I saw the shooter wearing a black sweatshirt and a red hat. Oh, really? Did you really? Well, was he interviewed the next day by the police? Detective Giossi came in and testified he was. Even Mr. Reeves admitted that he was. And even he admitted his memory's better, closer to the event in time than 2 years later. Did he mention to Detective Giossi that the shooter's wearing a black sweatshirt? No. Perhaps that's an important detail to mention when you go to the police station and you put in an interview room and the police ask you, what did you see? What did the shooter look like? It's the first thing you tell them. You don't forget something like that. And conveniently, 2 years later, in the middle of the trial, he tells you it's a black sweatshirt? Come on. His own son contradicted his entire testimony. Edward Reeves told you he passed by Metro PCS, and then he went into that Dunkin' Donuts parking lot and got out of the car and went to the parking lot area. You know that didn't happen. You know that. And Jeffrey Reeves came in here and told you that didn't happen. He told you we had my grandniece in the car, Edward Reeves' granddaughter. I went to the scene, he said, Jeffrey. I went to help. Jeffrey went to help Mr. Brown. And where was your father? He stayed by the car. He didn't go to the parking lot area. And we all went in the view. You all saw the area, familiar with it. We stood at different angles and locations, and we asked you to take a look at your vantage points. What do you see? And you remember we stood at the Dunkin' Donuts parking lot where Edward Reeves parked his car? You can't see anything. You can't see across that vacant lot, through the trees and shrubs, through the billboard, through the privacy fence, into that parking lot. Who else was the most important piece of evidence, or could have been, or should have been the most important piece of evidence besides Edward Reeves? Because we already know you can't rely on him. And Jeffrey didn't see anything. He didn't see the shooter, he didn't see the car. Or maybe he saw the car, but he didn't see the shooter. And he didn't see what the shooter was wearing. The only people you have left with is Brad D'Souza, Michael Oliver, the NSTAR or Eversource guys, and you have Derek Correa. Brad D'Souza, who was in the truck, and his legs were flying, he heard the shots, but he didn't see anything. Derek Correa, you all saw his testimony. Was he all over the place? How many things did he forget? Or was he mistaken about when he testified? What did he tell you? He was driving on Belleville Avenue heading towards Cogswell Street. So he's looking at Metro PCS, which is across the street to him and to his right. And he's either the second or the first or second car back. And he wants you to believe that when he was stopped at that light at that intersection, he saw two people running out of the car, out of the store. We know he didn't see their faces. He only saw them from behind. But then he wants you to believe that he takes a right and he's somehow able to see from Belleville Avenue through the back of the building, beyond the trees, beyond the fence, into that parking lot, And he first gets up there and he says, I saw the shooter getting into a black Mercedes. You know he didn't see that. He didn't see that. And when he was pressured on cross, he admitted he didn't see that. He was also interviewed the day after, or in the days after the incident. And I showed him transcripts. Yeah, you're right. I didn't actually see him get in the car. I didn't see that. It's an important detail to be wrong about, isn't it? If you're wrong about that, what else are you wrong about? And we all went on the view. And if you remember, the government led you to that area where they want you to believe where Mr. Correa made those observations. But where did they take you? They took you on the Cox Hall sidewalk right by the building. And they said, stand here and look. See what you see. Come on. You're smarter than that. You know very well that's not where Derek Correa was. Why didn't they just take you up to the fence and say, look from here? Look over the fence. And then we went across the street. And then we went across the street, and I asked you, from here, look. Because Mr. Correa was driving. He wasn't on the sidewalk alongside the building. He was on the other side. And we had the benefit, obviously, of police shutting down traffic, shutting down the area. We had unobstructed views. Correa didn't have that on January 22nd. You saw yourselves how busy the intersection was. The police told you how busy that was. And he didn't stop, he kept going. There's no way he could have seen what he told you he saw. So at the end of the day, how credible is Mr. Correa? Not very. Not very at all. So what does that leave us with? That leaves us with Michael Oliver, the Eversource gentleman, who was right there on the corner of Cox Hall and Granville Street. This is a man who heard the gunshots and then looked immediately. He was within feet of Mr. Brown. Within feet. He saw the shooting. He was in the best position of all the eyewitnesses to see what happened. He had the best unobstructed view of what happened. He had the best view of the shooter. And what did he tell you? He told you the shooter was shorter than Mr. Brown. Number one. And we know Mr. Brown was 5'7". Well, how tall is Mr. Valliere? You know he's 5'10". His license is in evidence. Just look at his driver's license, 5'10". Not shorter than Mr. Brown. He also told you the shooter was dark-skinned. Dark-skinned. Not light-skinned, dark-skinned. And then, what does he see? This guy actually goes towards the shooter. He goes towards him. He's focused on him. He follows him into that parking lot. The only eyewitness to do that. And he's in the best position to see where he goes. And where does he go? He tells you. He runs alongside the building of Metro PCS, the back side of the building along the parking lot. On the other side, from where the other witnesses said that Mercedes was parked. On the opposite side of that parking lot. And he runs along that building going towards where? Going towards the back area of the fence, going towards where that corner in that tree is. And he told you, I thought he jumped the fence. So what does he do? He tries to look for him. And he lost him. He's the guy that was in the best position to see what he saw. And when you evaluate all those civilian witnesses and all the eyewitnesses, the most important part of the government's case, that's where their house of cards collapses. Because you can't tell left from right and you can't tell up from down. And that house of cards just goes poof, and you have not only reasonable doubt, you have serious doubt. Because if you can't take the eyewitness testimony, and if you can't figure out and believe beyond a reasonable doubt, that's what happened, that's what the shooter did, that's what the shooter's wearing, that's where the shooter went. If you don't know, that's reasonable doubt. And that's why, even if you believe Mr. Valliere was there, of which there's no evidence anyways, but let's say you believe he's there, there's still no evidence that he was the shooter, because all the evidence that you heard from tells you otherwise. It tells you maybe not. Maybe he wasn't. It could have been somebody else. And then we get to, let me sidestep for a minute. I want to talk to you about those text messages in a little bit more detail. Because it's a bit of a smokescreen to you when you present with the case and you have nothing. And then they present these texts that I'm sure they're going to get up when I'm done and tell you, here you go, this is it, this is your circumstantial evidence, connect the dots. Well, it's not connect four. This is not a game. You need evidence. And those texts are not evidence. And even if you want to consider them, they tell you nothing. From Ray Valentin, that supposedly Mr. Valliere was looking for chops. He even told you chops can mean a million different things. And I went off this huge list. Okay? Let's say you believe he was looking for chops, that he was looking for guns. Let's say you believe that. This is a guy, Mr. Valentin, that was with Mr. Valliere every day. They didn't just text. They hung out together in the 2 to 3 weeks leading up to this incident. And he was asked several questions about those text messages. Did he ever get a gun to Mr. Valliere? No. Did he ever see Mr. Valliere with a gun? No. Did Mr. Valliere ever speak to him about Javon Brown? No. Did Mr. Valliere ever speak to him about Metro PCS? No. Did Mr. Valliere ever speak to him about a robbery? No. And then they have the texts and the conversations with Erica Rivera and Ms. Jana Howell, and they spent a lot of time about, where Mr. Valliere was that morning and what did he do. He hung out with Erica. They drove around town. They stopped and got coffee. They stopped in the area of Metro PCS on Belleville Avenue that morning, and Erica told you he got out of the car. Okay? Big deal. Big deal. Where did he go? You don't know. She doesn't know. Nobody knows. Did he go drop off his cell phone that morning, maybe? You have the text messages. The texts end at around 11 o'clock in the morning. Did Mr. Valliere even have his cell phone after 11 o'clock in the morning? you have no evidence either way. So at the end of the day, when you talk about those text messages, they mean absolutely nothing. And I fall back on my original point. All that is smoke and mirrors. It means nothing in this case. It's the eyewitnesses. It's those people who were the most important piece of evidence in this case. And they couldn't give you anything. And then we can talk about Justin Paris. Justin Paris was his neighbor, downstairs neighbor from 84 Frederick Street. And they made a big deal about calling him. Mr. Valliere was at the house. Okay? The only time Mr. Paris saw Mr. Valliere was when he knocked on his door and asked to use his phone. He doesn't know if he was gone that morning. He doesn't know if he was there all morning. He can't tell you anything before the time that he saw him. Speaking of which, what time did he see him? He told you he saw Mr. Valliere between 12:30 and 12:40. 12:30 and 12:40. When did the shooting happen? I think the evidence that it happened at 12:25. And when we went on the view, when we left the area of Coggeshall Street and Belleville Avenue, and we went along that route, and you were pointed out various locations of surveillance cameras, and then we ended up at Frederick Street, you all saw how long it took to get from Coggeshall to Frederick Street. You all saw the different streets that we took to go along that route. If Mr. Valliere was driving that car and he went back to Frederick Street, how did he get there in 5 seconds? Was somebody else driving that car? Did Mr. Valliere let somebody borrow his car that morning after he went home, after dropping off Erica? If there's a question in your mind, let me eliminate it. Because, once again, it's the government's own evidence that disproves their own case. Because, once again, when they spoke to you in their opening, they told you, we got the sweatshirt, we got the hat, we got the sneakers, and this proves that Mr. Valliere was the shooter. Oh, does it? Well, these are the sneakers that the police seized from 84 Frederick Street. These are the sneakers that the police and the government wants you to think that when Mr. Valliere shot Mr. Brown, he was wearing. He wasn't wearing these sneakers because he wasn't there. And how do you know that? That's because the government brought into hours and hours of DNA evidence and blood analysis. And you all saw pictures from the scene. There was blood everywhere. There was blood everywhere. From inside the store, to on the door, to on the glass, on the pole, on the ground, on the sidewalk, all along the route where Mr. Brown ended up collapsing on the sidewalk. If Mr. Valliere was the shooter, wouldn't there have been blood on these shoes? If he was chasing Mr. Brown and he was following him, he would have had to have stepped in that blood while chasing him. And there would have been blood on his shoes. The very shoes the government introduced to you to say, we got him. But then, you heard from, the DNA analysts, you heard from the forensic scientists, Jessica Robidoux, Ruth Ragnelson, Stephanie Harmon, Laura Bryant. And what did they do? They tested the clothing and the shoes and the Mercedes for blood evidence. They tested the shoes were negative. They tested the clothing, the pants. There was one speck of blood on one of the pairs of pants, but you know that they were Mr. Brown's, they were Mr. Valliere's blood. And they also tested the Mercedes. The interior, exterior door handles, the inside driver compartment area, the controls, the steering wheel, the gear shift. And they didn't find any, oh, and the trunk area and the glove box. And all those locations were negative for blood. And you would have to expect, in a case where a shooter is chasing somebody, shooting, and the victim is leaving a trail of blood, not one speck of blood on Mr. Valliere's clothes. Not one speck of blood of Mr. Brown's on the car, in the car. Not one speck. And about the black sweatshirt, let me remind you, going back to Justin Paris, he saw him minutes after the shooting happened. Minutes. And what did he tell you he was wearing? He wasn't wearing a red hat. He wasn't wearing a black sweatshirt. He told you Mr. Valliere was wearing a light gray sweatshirt. Minutes after the shooting. And then, if there's even any question about that, look at the surveillance video stills. You had a bunch of surveillance video, and granted on exhibits 118, D, E, and G, it's not clear, granted, but you can make out colors. You can see for yourselves and take note of the image of who's sitting in that driver's seat. Does it appear to you that the driver of this Mercedes is wearing a black sweatshirt or black clothing or dark clothing? You'll have a closer look at this when you go into the deliberation room and you can really analyze the exhibits. But it's not black. It's not black. So, we know that the blood, none of Mr. Brown's blood is on Mr. Valliere, or on his clothing, or in his car. And then they test the clothing for DNA. Well, it was determined by DNA that the clothes belonged to Mr. Valliere. Well, they were taken from his house. Even they told you that. You expect to find your own DNA in your own home and your own clothes that you're wearing, the clothes in your house. Your DNA's all over your house. But the point is not so much that his DNA was found in his own clothes. Remember what the DNA expert told you about DNA transference, about hand the DNA, touch DNA. I do this and how easy it is to leave my DNA on something. Aerosolized DNA, breathing on somebody, sneezing on somebody. Mr. Valliere, they want you to believe he was so close and shot Mr. Brown, and none of Mr. Valliere's DNA is on Mr. Brown, and none of Mr. Brown's DNA, not one microscopic piece of DNA is on Mr. Valliere's clothes. And if that's not reasonable doubt, look no further than the gunshot residue. Fancy terms, complex science, but you have no reason to doubt it. Mr. Biello, the state's own gunshot residue expert, came and told you about what gunshot residue is. And if you remember, you fire a gun, fumes of gases get emitted to the air, and when they cool, they form particles. And lead, anti, and barimony, when they form gunshot residue. And sure, he told you, well, you don't know where they land, and you don't know the quantity where they land. Use your common sense. We're not talking about one shot here. We're not talking about all the shots being outside in heavy winds. We're talking about, at least according to their evidence, 2, maybe 3 shots inside the store in a closed environment where there is no wind, at close range, and then more shots outside. And the more times you fire, the increased likelihood of gunshot residue powder being emitted, the increased likelihood that you're going to have, the shooter's going to have gunshot residue on his hands, on his clothing, on his black sweatshirt, on his pants, on his shoes. And he told you about transference and how small the particles are, how light they are, how easily they can be transferred. And that's why they stubbed the car. That's why they stubbed the exterior door handles, the interior door handles, the controls of that Mercedes, the steering wheel, and the gear shift. Because if the shooter, according to them, got into that Mercedes, we're going to have gunshot residue in the Mercedes. But we don't. There was none. There was 0 gunshot residue in the car. There was 0 gunshot residue on that black sweatshirt. Their own evidence disproves their own case. It can't get any more scientific and reliable than the blood and the gunshot residue or lack thereof. Because you know, if it was reversed, if there was gunshot residue in that sweatshirt, or if there was gunshot residue in the Mercedes, they'd be jumping up and down about that. Oh, look, Eureka! Look what we got! He had to have been the shooter. The shooter had to have gone to the Mercedes. We found gunshot residue. They would have been all over that. That's what they were hoping for. But they didn't get it. It wasn't there. And the reason it's not there is because Mr. Valliere was not the shooter. Even if he was there, the scientific evidence proves to you that Mr. Valliere was not the shooter. So what happens next? How does Mr. Valliere come to be placed under arrest? Do you remember? Detective Andrew Simmons told you how. Mr. Valliere called the next day the New Bedford Police Department. And he said, my car was towed, do you have it, is it there? And they looked for his car. They told him on the phone, your car's here, come pick it up. So he goes to go pick up his car. And that's when he's arrested. So, if they want you to think that Mr. Valliere's actions after the shooting suggest that he's the shooter, well then how does the fact that he went to pick up his car thinking it was towed and not knowing why suggest that he's connected to this shooting? They want you to believe that Mr. Valliere shot somebody at 12:30 in broad daylight on one of that area's busiest intersections, and then called the police and said, "Where's my car?" Ladies and gentlemen, use your common sense. I'd suggest that he called the police looking for his car because he didn't know why it got towed. That he was innocent of anything and just wanted to get his car back. And so when you look at the text messages with Gianna Howell, remember what she told you. They tried hard to get it to say things that weren't said. Mr. Valliere called Erica the next day and said, "Hey, I need a ride. Can you give me a ride?" He needed a ride because he didn't have a car. So I'll talk to you later. He called Gianna Howell too, another one of his friends. "What are you doing?" "Nothing." "Are we hanging out?" I need a ride. "I can't see you." "I'll talk to you later." Can't see you because he didn't have a car. It was towed. And it wasn't a conversation like they're going to want you to believe, "Hey, have a nice life. I'm taking off. You'll never see me again, ever again, because I shot somebody." None of that. It was nothing more than, "I don't have a car. I need a ride. I'll talk to you later." And that's it. When both counts are done with our closing arguments, Judge Garsh will explain to you what the law is. She'll explain to you certain legal principles, and whatever she tells you, that's the law. But I want to touch upon the instruction she's definitely going to give you about reasonable doubt. And I'd ask, when she does that, for each and every one of you to please pay particular attention to that instruction. It sounds simple. The concept may be simplistic, but perhaps not. And when you evaluate and you discuss amongst yourselves in that room about the case and whether or not the government has proven the case, you're going to think about it in the context of, have they proven their case beyond a reasonable doubt? And it's no secret, from day one, from when you first came in here, this was a circumstantial case. You have 0 eyewitnesses coming in here. Not one person sat in that chair and said, "He's the guy. He's the shooter." Not one. Not just that, no one came even close. No one came close. So they're going to ask you, the government's going to ask you, like they did before you were sat, you don't need direct evidence. Circumstantial evidence is just fine. It's not just fine, because in order for you to, well, what is circumstantial evidence? That means they're asking you to find a fact from a connection of other facts. They're asking you to connect the dots, to play Connect 4. But in order to do that, each and every fact that is the basis for the next one, you have to find beyond a reasonable doubt.
I will be giving you instructions, and what you have to find beyond a reasonable doubt are the elements of the crime. Circumstantial evidence is competent to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, and inferences need to be reasonable and possible, but an inference by itself does not have to be established beyond a reasonable doubt. I will be giving detailed instructions to you on the law.
So inferences need to be reasonable and possible. Okay. So when there are alternative reasonable inferences and possibilities, what does that tell you? That tells you you're not sure. That tells you you have reasonable doubt. That means you have to speculate. And if you have to speculate in any way with regard to any of the evidence, you have reasonable doubt. And even the judge will tell you in her instructions, you have reasonable doubt when you evaluate the evidence. You have to have an abiding conviction to a moral certainty when you evaluate the charges, whether those charges are true. Think about what those words mean. An abiding conviction to a moral certainty that the charge is true. So even if you have a belief that Mr. Valliere was there, even if you have a belief that Mr. Valliere was the shooter, even if you think there's a probability, even if you think there's a strong probability that he's the shooter, that he was there, that's not enough. You have, ladies and gentlemen, reasonable doubt in this case. The house of cards that they built collapsed one by one before your very eyes, beginning on day one and ending today. And when you go into that jury room, all you're going to have is a bunch of cards laying on the table with no structure, with no direction, with no sense of what really happened. This is not a game. This is not a joke. This is serious business. Mr. Valliere is on trial. Use your common sense. And I trust the only verdict that you'll be able to find conscientiously and confidently is that Mr. Valliere is not guilty of all charges. Once again, thank you for your time and attention. Thank you.